Tim, I want to open this conversation with a acknowledgement that I like talking about hard things. And we're going to talk about some hard things today. You've always really struck me as somebody who likes talking about hard things too, or at least very willing to go there. And in this iteration of Tim Sharp, I'm seeing you talk about hard things and personal hard things more and more. Can I ask you, if someone is listening to this and they're about to invest, say, the next 40, 45 minutes in this conversation, what's the one thing that you would hope that they would take away, whether it's from this conversation or from an interaction with you or from the work that you do in the world?
That's a good question, a tough question. And as someone that's been interviewed or done probably hundreds of these podcasts and been asked many of the same questions over and over again, I've never been asked that before. So as thought-provoking, I guess if there's one thing a listener out there might take away, well, hope you stay through the next 40 or 45 minutes because I'm sure it's going to be interesting knowing some of the work you do, Casey. But I hope you'll know that you can do hard things, and in fact, doing hard things ultimately, even if it's difficult in the short term, will be worth it in the longer term.
I turned 40 this year, and I wonder how you feel about
spring chicken
aging. Yeah, I feel, I've been toying with this idea of, I feel like I'm, at whatever that midlife point is, I'm really excited about what is to come. How do you feel about aging?
Well, I've got a few years on you, Casey, so I'm a little bit ahead of 40. But I suppose still, depending on how you define it, still in midlife, what might be called midlife. And look, it's interesting, another interesting question, because I've never really put much stock in the numbers. So, whether it was 18 or 21 or 30 or whatever, it never really meant that much to me. And I never could really understand why people did get either excited or anxious about a specific number, like why is 30 different to 29, for example. So in that sense, aging doesn't really mean that much to me. And I also, even at a more general sense, because it is something I've been very interested in, I've written about, at a more general sense, I'm not really sure that numbers are as meaningful as some people make them out to be. Because I think when people think about the different stages of life, and there's no doubt that there are, I think, different stages of life, but people go through those stages, I think, at different times of life. So what we might call midlife, and that someone might experience the phenomena of midlife at 20 or 25, whereas someone else that might not sort of hit them, or those sorts of changes might not happen until 60 or 65. So I do think we need to be a little bit wary of, putting specific numbers or, putting people into boxes or categories just purely based on, a numerical age. That being said, I think there's no doubt we do get through different stages of our lives. And I suppose what's supposed to happen, according to the research, I haven't quite experienced all of this myself, but what's supposed to happen in that midlife is that we're supposed to be a bit more comfortable in our own skin. We're supposed to be, a bit more set up and established in life. And I guess I have experienced that in some ways, but not in others, and certainly not in as many ways as I would have liked, I suppose.
It's funny, isn't it, how we kind of have these ideas of what life might look like at 40 or 50 or 60 or whatever it is. I think the thing that keeps coming up for me, and interestingly, I asked my audience this yesterday, if you do consider yourself midlife, how do you feel about that? Drop your thoughts to me. And it was overwhelmingly positive for all of the reasons that you just suggested. We do feel more comfortable in our own skin. We give way fewer forks to things that don't deserve it. It does feel like a recalibration or some kind of reckoning. And I think about it as a significant opportunity to look forward. If you consider, the analogy of a football game, it really is that sort of, we're at the halftime mark and it's like the halftime performance. And what do we want the next little bit to look like? From a clinical psychologist's perspective, from a human being's perspective, what do you think are the things that we can and should be doing in this opportunistic time, that recalibration, to contribute to a long and happy and hopefully healthy life?
Well, maybe just to step back a bit and re-answer your early question, I suppose, because I think, it's often not what we expect it to be. And to be perfectly honest, my midlife, for want of a better term, is definitely not what I expected to be. In fact, to be honest, at the risk of getting too serious too early in the chat, I didn't even expect to be alive at this stage of my life. I don't know how deep you want to go into this, but for many, many years, I didn't think I would live this long for a variety of reasons. In fact, I actively had planned not to live this long. So to get to where I am now and to be in the position I'm in now is in uncharted territory to me. And I never really had a plan B. So when I got to a certain point in life, which I thought would be the end, I really entered a bit of a different type of depression and uncertainty, because it was just not something I ever thought I would have to deal with, I guess. And then even when I did start to think about that, again, it was nothing like I imagined it to be, because my life was nothing like I'd imagined to be. And what I've achieved in the last 10 or 20, professionally, I had no idea that I would do that I could do that I would follow this path. As we've talked about before, and as I'm sure we'll talk about a lot today, I was extremely lost in my youth. So to find a path in itself was surprising and unsettling almost, to actually have that clarity for years. But that's a sort of very personal one. To answer your question more, I guess more professionally, the sorts of things we can do, and this is the other reason why I'm a bit unsure about the aging and the positive aging movement, which I've written a lot about, is the sorts of things that we can all do to live not just a long life, but a long and good life. And I think that's important. There's a lot of talk about longevity, which is obviously, for some people a goal, but I don't think we necessarily want to live a long life if it's full of sickness and misery, I suppose. So we want to have a long and a good life. And again, so the sorts of things that we can all do are the same sorts of things that we should be doing or would be wanting to try and do to live a healthy life at any age. It really isn't that different. I mean, what do we want to do to live a long and healthy life? Look after our physical health and well-being, get lots of sleep, eat well, exercise. What do we want to do to be healthy and happy at any age? Stay connected, build our positive relationships, foster and develop connection and belonging. What do we want to do at any age? Have some sort of meaning and purpose. Now, some of those things will change. I guess my meaning and purpose now is quite different to what it was at, 40, 30, 20 or whatever. And I'm sure I'm guessing that your reason for living now, so after having kids, for example, it changes. At different stages in our career, it changes. When our financial situation changes, So, but the basic principles don't really change. And I guess that's what, my answer is, whether you're 60 or 50 or 40 or 30, the principles of health and well-being are pretty much the same.
I want to ask you about being an expert, but I can't put down what you just offered to us, which was a glimpse into a mindset or a feeling that you weren't going to be around forever. Was that because life was just too painful for you and you just had never imagined that you would be able to stick around? Because what came to me when you were telling me that story about how lost you felt in your youth was that kind of analogy of a road. And on every road or every street, you kind of get to these little T-junctions, I suppose, and you go left or you go right. And it sounds like there were a lot of times in your youth, in your early life, and maybe even to this day, where you had to make some big decisions. Do I stay or do I go, essentially? And I'm wondering, what were the things that made you turn one way rather than the other way? Have you spent much time analysing that?
Have I spent much time thinking about that? Probably way too much time. And not all of it helpful. Look, to be perfectly honest, what got me through some of that was dumb plain luck. Look, in past years, I would have sort of proffered a trigger warning here. And I will say, to anyone that sort of finds this upsetting or distressing, please reach out and ask for help. I don't necessarily do that as much anymore, because there's, without getting too technical, the research about trigger warnings suggests that they're not really that useful. They don't really. The idea is that we pre-warn someone so they can prepare themselves for what might be distressing or disturbing information. Again, some research that I'm familiar with says that doesn't really make much difference. But again, anyone out there that finds this disturbing, please seek help. Take whatever care you need to. But what I do want to talk about, I guess, is suicidality. The conversation around mental health in recent years, or recent decades, I suppose, has blossomed enormously, and that's a fantastic thing. There's I guess many of you would have seen the hashtag "It Ain't Weak to Speak." We can reach out for help. Are You OK Day? We have all these fantastic initiatives now, which didn't exist when I was younger, and I wholeheartedly believe that's been one of the most important and beneficial initiatives, whatever you want to call it, advances in the mental health and wellbeing space, because there's no doubt at all that talking about these things is helpful. And I think if I'd heard more people talk about it when I was younger, I do feel it would have helped me a lot. So, but what hasn't progressed as far is talk about suicidality. And yet I think that's just as important. A significant number of people listening today, a significant number of Australians every single year will have thoughts of self-harm. And yet we still have the stigma that we've partially smashed in the area of mental health. We haven't really touched when it comes to suicidality or self-harm. And, I think that's problematic. I think we do need to talk about it. And so to come back to your question, I've spent a significant proportion of my life experiencing suicidal thoughts, thoughts of self-harm, and to be perfectly blunt, have acted on that on a numerous of occasions. What got me through it predominantly was having children. And that's a whole other discussion that initially I was quite reluctant to have children for many, many years because of my mental health and my lack of confidence that I could be a good father, be a good husband, and my fear, to be honest, that I would pass that on to my children. And again, I think this is something we don't talk a lot about. I know there's a lot of parents who feel like that they, that what if my children inherit my depression or anxiety or whatever it might be, and that's another discussion, I suppose. But for want of, to cut a long story short, I was convinced, I suppose, by my wife, and to be honest, and to be perfectly frank, don't regret it at all. One of probably the most wonderful, incredible thing that's happened in my life. But when that did happen, I made a promise to myself that I would stay alive for my children. It's a little bit more complex than that. But I wasn't sure how long that would last once they got to a certain age, once they became sort of adults, I suppose. Now I sort of feel that, I'm always a parent, no matter how old they get. So I suppose that line became a bit blurry when initially I thought it was a bit more clear cut. But what got me through it again was dumb luck and failure, to be honest, and then having that reason to live my children, and I suppose more so and ongoing for my wife, I suppose. Even when I don't feel like I want to live, I think for whatever reason she wants me to, and that usually gets me through the difficult times.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about, and I don't quite know how to ask this, but I feel like there are a lot of people listening to this who would be familiar with standing on the train platform and a train being about to come through and thinking to themselves, what would happen? What would happen if I just stepped forward? What would happen if I just jumped off? What would happen if I just... And I have this interesting internal dialogue often, and you and I have spoken about it privately in the past. And that's this kind of dichotomy or this fight between our internal world and our external world, and what is normal, quote unquote normal, and what is not normal. And as you were talking, I thought, I wonder how many people are listening to this thinking, I have thought about harming myself. Does that mean that is that suicidality? Because I've thought about those things many times. I would never act on them. I want to be here. How do you tease apart what is just a normal, strange thought that you can kind of pay no attention to and something that is of concern? I might be asking you to suck eggs here, but I feel like there are people listening that will want to understand the difference.
No, I think that's a really, really good and really important question. And again, a question that doesn't get asked a lot, a discussion that's not had a lot, because largely of stigma or just people are afraid to raise this topic. But it's a very, very important topic, because I can guarantee that a number of people listening to this and many, many people out there would have had some version of what you've just described. And I suppose to try and answer it as simply as possible, and it is by definition, this will be an oversimplification because it's a very complex and nuanced topic. But there's kind of three levels that we can think about these types of thoughts. There are what we might just broadly call intrusive thoughts that we all have at times, and some of which might seem really strange, really weird, really unusual, and we might be embarrassed or feel ashamed that we have them. And they might be about harming ourselves or even harming others or doing strange things to others, So we might be sitting on a bus and there might be a person in front of us, and we might feel about, have this random thought, what if I tap them on the head? Or, I mean, there's all sorts of bizarre thoughts, which, we could smile and smirk a lot about, but lots of people have these thoughts on a daily basis. And normally, more often than not, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean you're mad. It doesn't mean you're crazy. It doesn't mean you're having some sort of psychotic episode or whatever. Many people just have strange and random thoughts. Now, for the majority of people, they will just shake them off and say, oh, that was a weird random thought, and it will disappear and never go. For a small percentage of people, for a variety of reasons, which probably don't need to go into now, they'll be more pervasive, they'll be more sticky, as sometimes we call it, and they might develop into something a bit more serious. But for the majority of the people, it's really not a problem, essentially. So these are just random intrusive thoughts. Then we have what another group of related ones, going back to your question, is what we call, and a lot of people don't understand this difference, what's called passive suicidality. The idea that in some ways I would like to die, I don't want to go on any further, but I'm not necessarily going to take any action. It's almost like, well, I kind of would just be a great relief if I got hit by a bus sort of thing, but I won't do it, I won't step out on the road or whatever. And that's what we call passive suicidality or passive self-harm, where those thoughts happen and we might think it would be a good thing, but we won't necessarily take any action. And then finally, there are more active suicidal thoughts where people are starting to think about what they would do, make plans, and that's obviously the most concerning level. So, again, you can look at that. It's not necessarily on a continuum because they don't necessarily lead from one to the other. But, there's a significant number of people, I'd say a majority of people, have the first, these random, strange, weird, intrusive thoughts. A slightly less, but still significant number of people have those passive suicidal ideation. And then a smaller, but still significant number of people who have active suicidality.
It's interesting that you mentioned parenting, because I think that parenting is, on one hand, such a savior for so many people, like you said, for you, and for others, and maybe in me, I think both exist, is incredibly fear-inducing. I am terrified of the world in ways that I probably wasn't before. I look after myself better for all of the reasons that you just described, but I also am scared of what the world might do to them. I reflect on my experiences. I don't want those experiences for them. I just want to wrap them up in that sort of metaphorical cotton wool and really protect them forever. But you mentioned that sort of passive suicidality, and one of the things that has come up for me a lot in the past is I don't want to die. I just want to have a long sleep. I just want to wake up in a bit. I just want to hit the pause button on the world and wake up in a few days or a week when this thing is over, or, when we're going through something difficult, whether it's grief or it's some sort of job loss or feeling lost, to use your title of your book. I think that those times of being lost are some of our greatest times of growth in retrospect. But when you're in them, that feeling of being lost, of being stuck, whatever you want to call it, it's a really sucky feeling.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I hope I haven't hijacked the conversation and taken us down a pretty dark and depressing route. But secondly, within that question, there are two or maybe even three significant themes that run through my new book, Lost and Found. So I'll start with the parenting one first, for example. So it's again a common fear. I think every parent has, at different levels, I suppose, concerns, for their children. I mean, no parent wants to see their child hurt or in pain, physically or psychologically. We don't want to see our kids get smashed up or break bones, and we don't want to see them, upset or distressed. So that's a normal protective care. If you're a caring, protective parent, of course you're going to feel that. However, and so that is normal, I suppose. But what we do need to do is consider then about how to respond to that. So there's nothing wrong at all with caring for your children. Obviously, with loving your children, with wanting to protect them. There's, in fact, that's a good thing. However, the wrapping them up in cotton wool bit, or the overprotecting, is not necessarily good. There are significant problems associated with this. And I write about this. I start some research in my book about this because it really is quite quite fascinating. And it's not just a parenting thing. So, it sort of has broader implications as well. What we know from the research about that is that overprotective parents, and there's a variety of names that are used for them, sort of thing, but overprotective parents, feel that they're protecting their children from something, but don't realize that they're actually causing more harm in other ways. So, for example, children that grow up under overprotective parents tend to grow up more anxious, more risk averse. So they're less likely to take challenges, so less likely to achieve in certain ways. So we might think, they're not going to get damaged now, but we're in a sense damaging them in other ways further down the track. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not saying to parents, just let your kids go out and do anything or everything at all. Of course, that would be, that would not necessarily be sensible for a variety of reasons. But what it is about is allowing them to take small risks, calculated risks, to get dirty in the playground, literally and metaphorically, and also to help them learn to sit with, and this comes back to the adult issue, I suppose, to sit with those feelings. So when I talk about taking risks, when I talk about being lost and found, it's also about the lostness bit is also about the lost side of psychological distress, I suppose, and not necessarily. So the adult version of that overprotecting kids, if we try to overprotect ourselves, that's when we might go to bed for a few days. That's when we might avoid things. Now, again, that might seem like a sensible sort of plan, and it does kind of help in the short term. But what we also know is that avoidance creates other problems in the longer term. And it's not even just going to bed for a few days. We all do this in small versions every minute of every day when we go on our phones and scroll. When we use distraction is a version of avoidance. And again, it feels good in the short term, but it causes more problems in the longer term. So essentially, we need to allow our kids to feel some pain, hopefully not too much and not for too long. We need to allow ourselves to sit with that pain. And that's really what it's about. It's about lost and found. It's about finding ourselves within the lostness. We know from the research, from other researchers, that if we can learn to sit with the pain, if we can let our kids experience, hopefully not too much, but a little bit of physical, psychological pain, then ultimately, although that's harder in the short term, it's better in the long term. So it's like a lot of these, or like all of these things, it's easier said than done. But this is something that we've gone, I think we've lost a lot of skills in, or some of us have never developed these skills to be able to sit with pain, to see that lostness is something that will prove advantageous in the long term. One of the questions I've started to ask people a lot is, have you ever experienced a significant failure in your life? Yes, we all have. But have you ever looked back on that a week, a month, a year later and thought, well, in some way or other, I learned something from that, and as a result grew stronger, better, wiser, happier? And I think we can all we all nod our heads to that. And that doesn't mean that original event was pleasant. Of course it wasn't. But from failure can come growth and development and improvement. And so we need to not just accept that within failure there might be success, but learn to actively embrace it and seek it out in appropriate ways.
I've heard so many entrepreneurs say things like, I'm not better or smarter than anybody else. I just fail faster. I just find more ways to fail so that I can learn from them so that eventually I can crack it. What would you say? How would you answer that question of one of your big failures that you learned something from? Because, professionally, we play in a not dissimilar space. I've interviewed you many times. I've had the pleasure of kind of getting to know you professionally over the last sort of 10 years or so. And I'm wondering, what would you say would be one of your big failures professionally that you really learned something from? Because from where I sit, you've had this really sort of golden run. It seems to me that Dr. Tim Sharp, anything he touches turns to gold. You could pitch anything and get it up. You're one of those experts that you're an absolute, what's the right word? Like, you're a sure thing. You're never going to stuff it up. You'll always bring the goods. You love what you do. You know your stuff inside, outside, backwards, and you're a pleasure to work with. And I'm wondering, that's how it looks from the outside. How does it feel from the inside? And is there a big failure that you would be willing to share with us that you really learned something from?
Well, firstly, thank you for some of those kind words. It's not how it feels on the inside. In fact, to go back to a previous conversation, I suppose I spend a lot of my time, too much of my time, thinking that I'm a complete and utter failure in every area of my life, not just professional life. So when, can I share an example? Well, we probably need a 10-hour podcast to share all of what I believe to be the failures in my professional career. But and that's just my professional career, not my personal life. But yeah, well, look, there are, and I write about this again in the book. So the book's sort of part memoir, and it's been funny. A couple of people my brother, for example, who's known me my whole life, read the book and said he learned more about me in a couple of hundred pages than he's learned in the last 50 odd years or whatever. One of my best friends said the same thing. We catch up for lunch almost every couple of weeks, and he said he learned a lot more about me than he'd ever realized. But I suppose so I share a lot of what I perceive to be my failures. But I suppose one or two of the more obvious ones, I suppose, was, for example, completing my PhD. Now, on the one hand, I still look back at completing a PhD as one of my greatest achievements ever, professionally. So I was working full-time at the time, doing my PhD part-time, basically evenings and weekends. So that's bloody hard slog. Anyone who's ever done anything like that knows how hard. I know you're studying on the side of many, many other activities, being a mother, being a professional, etc. So it's bloody hard work. I did it in close to record time with virtually no revisions requested. And look, even apart from it, anyone that's done a postgraduate degree of any sort, even an undergraduate, it's a great achievement. And a PhD particularly, I suppose, because by definition, your thesis has to be an original piece of work. So it's good. It's another level up, I guess. So why would I think of that as a failure? Because within a year or two I completed that, believing that I wanted to be a clinical academic, which I was at the time. So I was working full-time as a clinician, as a therapist, running a group therapy program at a very early. I was deputy director of this program, so I was already achieving a degree of success. I'd started already, even before completing my degree, to work in the area that was my dream job, a clinical academic. So I was lecturing, doing research, had an appointment at the University of Sydney, which is a highly regarded academic institution. And when I completed that, I was already doing it essentially, and completing my PhD was kind of like just the final tick saying, right, you really are this thing that you dreamed of being for 10 years or whatever it was. But within a year of that, I essentially dropped out of that particular career path. I quit my job, went into private practice, which is not something I'd ever even thought of before. It took everyone by surprise, including myself. Because I realized that even though I spent all this time working towards it, and I realized that academia wasn't for me. I just wasn't suited to the bureaucracy and the red tape and the limitations. I mean, I think academia is incredibly important to have researchers and lecturers doing the work they do. But for me personally, for a variety of reasons. So in a sense, I'd put all of this blood, sweat and tears into achieving this thing, which essentially I walked away from, I think it was about a year or two later. However, in hindsight, that wasn't necessarily a failure because it led to, when I went into private practice, I discovered an entrepreneurial gene and I started to build what led to be 2 or 3 different businesses, psychology-related businesses, that led to me doing all sorts of other wonderful and exciting things that I'd never dreamed of before. I wouldn't have even thought about doing. I mean, writing the books and public speaking and TV and media work. So I guess this is an idea behind Lost and Found, that failure and success can live and breathe within the same moment almost. And I guess that's just one example of it's hard for me to describe it as a success or a failure because it's all at the same time.
Well, it's so true. I can hear how tough you are on yourself, and I really subscribe to that. And it's funny, you said something like, I feel like a failure most of the time, or I don't know, they're not the right words, but you said something like that. And I don't know if you saw me, because you can see me, but people listening can't unless they're watching on YouTube. I kind of put my hand on my heart and sort of, I don't know, squished my face up. Like it hurt me to hear that, to hear you say that about yourself. And then I thought, that's exactly how I feel about myself. Like, why do I have so much compassion hearing you say that? But when I'm beating up on myself, that's kind of okay. And one of the things that you and I have talked about professionally, personally, it's very well trodden narrative in psychology and certainly in kind of personal development, is this idea of self-compassion. And much easier said than done. It's like I forget about these things, that they exist for, 100 times a day, 100 times a year. But since I lost my dad last year, my motto has been gently, gently. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why I adopted it. But when I have been beating up on myself, it has been the words that I've said to myself and the words that have come. With my master's, I'm trying really hard to get really decent grades because my not enough story has always been that I'm not smart enough. And with my master's, I really challenged myself to find some evidence that that's just not true, so that I've got some data and I can kind of start actively reworking that. And I just want to understand, for everything that for everything that you could say to me or to anybody else, that being kind to yourself piece doesn't seem to be our default setting. And it's really bloody hard. And I'm wondering, it feels to me like a bit of a dance between grace to ourselves and gumption, like get on with it. Like, what does that dance look like and feel like in you, who knows probably more about this topic than anyone in the country and arguably one of the most in the world? Like, what is this kind of simple but really challenging to implement concept of self-compassion look like and feel like in you?
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing, Casey. And for what it's worth, you're more than intelligent enough from the experiences I've had with you. But again, it's something I can say to other people. If I could say that to myself, it would be very valuable as well. Look, to be perfectly honest, for me, and I suspect for you as well, and for lots of people out there, I think it is self-compassion has increasingly become the most important thing for my health and well-being. It's something, despite what I was saying a bit earlier, I have got a bit better at. I think quite a bit better at, but it's still a constant challenge, minute by minute, day by day. It's so easy to sort of fall off the wagon. So every time I feel like I've made a step or a few steps forwards, something will knock me back again. But I do think it's incredibly, incredibly important and valuable. And it's, again, something I've been talking and writing more about in recent years. Just to go back to your personal example, which I can very much relate to, and I'll share my version of what you just described there. This was part of my problem. For whatever reason, and I want to make this point to begin with. I certainly don't blame my parents at all, because I think my parents, loved me as best they could. Did, as most parents do, they did the best they could with what they had at the time. But for whatever reason, I grew up feeling not worthy, not good enough, not intelligent enough, similar to sort of what you described. And so my version, and this is very, very common, it's what you've described, and I think a lot of people relate to it. My strategy to beat that was to achieve. If only I can achieve more and more, I'll feel better and better myself. So I'll go and get a university degree. Oh, that's not enough. I'll get a master's degree. Oh, that's not enough. I'll get a PhD. Oh, that's not enough. I'll write a book. Oh, that's not enough. I'll write 7 books. It doesn't work. This is a common mistake we make, trying to fill up a hole with achievements where the hole's not from lack of achievement. My lack of worthiness is not from lack of achievement. It's from a lack of belief in who and what I am. We never turn around to a newborn baby or even a toddler and say, you're not worth anything because you don't have any university degrees, you haven't made $1 million, you haven't started a new company or run an Olympic gold medal. We think they're valuable and worthy because they're a beautiful human being. And yet we don't really apply that to ourselves. So this is one of the mistakes. I've tried to fill up my life from a position of lack of worthiness, and you can never fill that up. That hole is just way, way too big to fill up with those sorts of things. So I need to, this is where self-compassion comes in, because self-compassion is about being kind, being gentle with yourself, unrelated to achievements. Now, this doesn't mean achievements are bad. They're not bad at all. There's no doubt that a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment is a good thing. And that's accomplishment and achievement and satisfaction and pride. They're all good, important components of versions of happiness. However, we can, it's a big risky game to play if we think they're going to fill up those holes of unworthiness, uselessness, hopelessness, whatever. So we need to take a different approach. My approach was always, if I can achieve enough, then I'll feel good enough. Well, no, I need to feel good enough before any of that will make any difference. And to come back to your question, this is where self-compassion. So for those of you who aren't familiar, and thank you for the compliment, but really all of my talk and work on this area has been borrowed very much from other experts in the world, particularly Kristen Neff, who I'm guessing you might be familiar with. She's probably the world's leader in this area. And there is, there's a lot of really great people, but the reason I love her model is that it's really bloody simple. And she breaks it down into three pillars, in a sense, or three components, which I'll just quickly describe here, because I do think that, I love the simplicity, but that doesn't mean it's easy to do. So we still need, simple isn't always easy. But anyway, the first one of her three pillars is mindfulness, and that's not, when I say mindfulness, I don't mean a form of relaxation or meditation. It's really a form of awareness. It's about being psychologically aware about what we're saying to ourselves. That inner critic, that inner bully, the stuff that I say to myself that I would never say to anyone else. The first thing we need to do is be aware of it, because we can't change or do anything about that if we're not aware, if we're denying it or repressing it or avoiding it or distracting ourselves from it. So this is the first bit, is being mindful. What am I saying to myself? How do I feel about myself? That's it. Just being aware of that, spending time paying attention to all of that shit that goes on in our heads every minute of every day. The next part, the second part, and sorry, I should say this is in some ways presented in different order, and the order doesn't necessarily matter, but this is the order that makes most sense to me, but you can switch it around or mix it up a bit. But the first bit is mindfulness. The second part is the realization that many of us, if not all of us, say this shit to ourselves. I do it. You said you do it. Many people do it to a greater or lesser extent. You and I might be more at the negative end of the spectrum, for want of a better phrase, but everyone does it to some extent. Everyone criticizes themselves or put themselves down or discounts their achievement. And so this second bit's quite important, because when I feel really bad, which unfortunately happens more than I like, what makes it even worse is when I think I'm the only one. I'm the only stupid idiot that can't cope with the world, that's puts themselves down, that can't enjoy life or whatever. And what makes it even worse for me, and you might be able to rate, is I think I should know better. I've got all these degrees in psychology. I've been a therapist. I've been a coach. And so it's even more stupid for me, who should know better. I can teach other people. Why can't I teach ourselves? Mm. But the reason the second bit's important is to know that we're not alone, that it's actually just part of being a human being. Is there really anyone out there that feels great about themselves every minute of every day? It's not. Now, again, some of us, there's a continuum, and some of us are more at the dark end of the spectrum than others, but everyone, to some extent, experiences some of these negative thoughts and negative emotions, or self-criticism, or whatever you might want to call it. So you've got the mindfulness or the self-awareness, which is really important. That's just a fundamental for any version or any form of self-help, really, is self-awareness or psychological insight, whatever you want to call it. The idea that we're all connected through this is what makes us humans. And then the third bit comes to your motto, which I love, by the way, which is about gentleness or kindness, treating ourselves the way that we would treat a best friend. So as soon as you describe some of your self-criticism, I can immediately know what to say to you, to encourage you, to support you. But I don't say that to myself. And so many of us are good at it. Many of us are far better at helping and supporting, holding the hand, either literally or metaphorically, of our loved ones, of our friends, of our children, of our partners, whoever. If we can do that to ourselves, that's the third bit, treating ourselves with the kindness or gentleness or compassion that we treat loved ones, then that would go a long way to helping us get through these difficult moments.
It's so interesting, isn't it, though, because we all feel like we're in here alone. And there is, from what I hear you say, there is some real value and benefit in, I don't know, you're kind of cloning yourself, right? To become sort of have this secondary version of you that is kind of coaching yourself. And that can feel really silly sometimes. One of the things that has started happening to me as I have stepped more and more into this space, I've been quite vocal in the media about advocacy for care and aged care, particularly for the sandwich generation, which has been my experience of caring for small children and my father. And I feel really passionate and really worried actually for what the future holds for us. And so trying to step more into that space and be a bit of a voice for people who may not have one, and a little bit of a light, hopefully, to kind of guide along the way. But one of the things that has started happening as a result of that visibility is that people have started reaching out to me and asking for my advice on what to do in a certain setting. And 9 times out of 10, that setting is, I know what's really important. I know that I'm going to get to the end of my life and I'm not going to care how many sales I made, how many pairs of shoes I owned, how many followers I had on Instagram. I'm going to care about who I loved and how I loved them. And I know that. And I also have these big dreams and goals and aspirations, and I have one life and only one life. And I don't know how to coexist with those two things. It's like, I can't make them both work, and essentially looking to me to help them make the decision. Maybe they're living overseas and should they move home because their parents are getting older, but where they're living is the only place that they can chase that one dream. And my answer is almost always the same, which is, this is such a personal decision. Like, I can't answer this for you. It comes down to what you want to feel when you look back on your life. And the only thing that I know about when I got the call from Dad saying that he was sick was that I was getting on a plane, and I was getting on a plane immediately. Now, did that mean that I chose family over career? Yes, probably, though I didn't think about it like that. I just did my best to kind of make it work. But I am interested in your thoughts around these two kind of big constructs, right? Which is like, what's going to matter at the end of our lives? And if you're midlife like we are, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So we are starting to think about some of those things. And we've got these big kind of goals and dreams. Like, how do you balance that in yourself? I know your kids are a little bit older than mine, but you've still got these competing objectives, so to speak. And how do you work that out at this point, knowing what you know now?
Well, firstly, to go back to the beginning of your question, thank you for the work you're doing, because I think it's really important. I am in a similar position, maybe a few years ahead in terms of that sandwich generation. And I think, and it is something that's starting to be talked about. It's a very real and very challenging situation for many, many people now, and will continue to be. And it hasn't been talked about that much up until it's a very relatively recent topic, but it's a very important one. So thank you for the work you're doing in that area. Look, my answer, again, I suppose, will come back to the idea of being lost and found. And by that, I mean, the answer is that I don't think any of us will get this perfect. And we need to be okay with that. We need to be okay with the fact that we'll feel torn at times. I've started to, I think at the beginning or somewhere earlier on in this conversation, you referred to me as an expert. I've actually started referring to myself as a recovering expert, because increasingly I realize I've got no fucking idea what I'm doing about anything, excuse the language. But I think I don't know, maybe that's a version of wisdom. But to come back to your question, I've been talking about a similar thing for a long, long time. And that's the balance, I suppose, between self-care and selflessness. And if I take care of myself, is that selfish? Shouldn't I be taking care of others? Well, really, the answer is we need to do both. I can't be a good husband, father, professional, anything if I'm sick and tired and miserable. But by taking care of myself, I can hopefully do a better job of those things. So we need to be able to balance, and it's going to be constantly being to and fro, pulling different directions or whatever. And I think it's the same or similar situation here. There's nothing wrong at all, of course, with having aspirations and goals, and trying to achieve. In fact, it's a wonderful thing. But there's also no doubt that takes hours, and that can take you away from mothering or fathering or parenting or whatever. But then I would say, if you as a mother, you want to be a good role model, or father, whatever, you want to be a good role model to your children. So achieving some degree of professional success is setting a good example for them. But if you're never at home and they never see you, then you're an absent parent. So again, it's a constant tug of war, a constant, and to come back to what I said earlier, I suppose, I don't think we'll ever get it perfectly right, not all the time. Even if we get it right for sort of 1 minute of one day, the next day will be different, or the next week will be different. But again, I suppose, we need to learn to be okay with that discomfort, with that uncertainty, with that imperfection. And I suppose that's my answer. You said quite rightly, there's no right answer. We're all different. Well, even if there were an answer for you, that will never be a perfect answer. And again, we've got to be okay with that imperfection.
It's so true. I'd heard you say about being a recovering expert, and I just want people listening to this to understand what an expert in the media is called on to do, particularly in this space, whether it's health and wellbeing or psychology or even kind of politics or whatever it might be. In essence, a media brand often will call on you, Dr. Tim Sharp, to say, Tim, it's Valentine's Day. We want you to come on the show and we want you to synthesize the construct of romantic love into 3 talking points so that people eating their Weet-Bix can learn something and feel something and stay on this channel for the rest of the day, is essentially what it is. And I've always been so in awe of many of the experts I've worked with, but particularly with you, at your ability to effectively speak in sound bites, whether I've been interviewing you on camera for an editorial piece, whether it's been podcasts like this. That's part of knowing your stuff, and being able to articulate it is quite a skill. Is or was going down that road of being an expert and constantly being asked to and trying to compress these big, meaty, complex constructs into simple terms for an audience to digest. Was that part of that chapter of lostness for you? Did that feel like a facade? Or have you just grown out or grown past it?
It's a good question. It's an interesting one. And it's something I was going to say struggled with. That's probably not the right word. Grappled with, I guess, for many years. Because, so if I go back to something I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons, there were many reasons I left academia, so it wasn't right for me. But one of the many frustrations was, so for example, when I completed my PhD, 3.5 years of blood, sweat, and tears. I can't even, 100,000 words, whatever. I don't even know how many words it was, whatever. I think that was probably read by 5 people. And then even so out of that came a number of academic publications, which might have been read by tens, maybe 100 people or whatever. And, that wasn't why I did my PhD, but I do remember it distinctly feeling, well, God, this is so much interest to me. Why weren't more people reading this? Or how could I? And that's when I started to think, well, how can I get the message out to more people? And so that was, and academia, well, back then just wasn't even interested or set up for that. It's a little bit different now, but not much different. I didn't quite know what that would look like. Eventually that led to some of the work that you described, some of the media work that I've done. So on the one hand, I did always love this idea. That's what got me into writing books and media work, was to get a message, what I thought was an important message, out to a broader, wider audience. And to do that, by definition, to do that, you do need to simplify. And, for whatever reason, I worked out fairly early on that was something I was good at. Thank you for the compliment earlier. I don't quite know how or why, and I did work hard at it. But, that was something I was good at, and I worked hard to get better at, was to condense important messages into short, sharp sound bites, for want of a better word, and to communicate them in language that the average person without 3 degrees in psychology could understand. But the flip side of that is that, again, by definition, an oversimplification does need to leave out a lot of the nuances, a lot of the sophistications, a lot of the detail. And so that was, so a lot of academics, for example, would look down on what I do or criticize and saying, well, it's an oversimplification. Things aren't that, and they're right. So that's, again, that's another one of these constant sort of tug and wars. But I suppose for a variety of reasons, I thought it was important, because at that time there wasn't really anyone in psychology doing what I was trying to do. There's certainly more people now. There was no one really trying to communicate to a general public what I thought were important and helpful, principles of human behavior, things that people could integrate into their lives. So, again, the idea of expert, and then I suppose the more and more I've learned over the years, the more I've realized I don't know also. And the more you try to simplify things, the more you realize that there's subtleties that you just can't include. So I still don't really know the answer to that. In some ways, I think is that I think that there's more I don't know now than I've ever known. I feel sort of less expert than I've ever known. But on the other hand, I also sort of feel a kind of wisdom in a way that, that comes with age. And I suppose that's coming back to one of the questions earlier about sort of this middle age, especially as a professional, I'm in some ways should be at the peak of my career. And yet I feel like I no bugger all. So I don't know the answer to that.
Oh, it's such a refreshing idea though, and this kind of learning and unlearning, and to use the concept of your book, this, getting lost and finding yourself again. I think I long ago learned that life was not going to be linear, and certainly success was not going to be linear. And if anything, it's this kind of circular staircase. It's like, oh, here we are again at this this section, and it's a little bit snakes and ladders for me. And
I was going to say, mine's more like an Escher staircase. I never quite know if I'm going up or down.
But there's something really comforting in that, and I think to your point, for myself, getting older, it does feel like there is more of a comfort in the discomfort of that. That, when things are good, don't get too comfortable, because things, they can change any second. And when things aren't, that conceivably they're going to come to an end, and sort of just to be able to sit in the discomfort of that is probably one of the greater gifts that getting older has started to deliver for me. I'm mindful of the time, and I know that I need to get you out of here, but I want to end on this question, which is, do you think that the pursuit of excessive comfort and that avoidance of discomfort is lending itself to our sort of general dissatisfaction? And I know that that's a sweeping statement. It's certainly true in my life. It seems to be true in a lot of the lives of the people around me. And I think it's what's being reflected to me more broadly from social media and the media. In your opinion, is our pursuit of comfort or our expectation of comfort to blame for that?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying something I've said a lot in different contexts in answer to different questions, is that I don't think there's no one thing that contributes to our to rising rates of mental health or to distress or whatever. There are a multitude of factors, and different combinations of different factors will be relevant or applicable to different people. It's not just one, but I do think that's a significant one. And one of the triggers to my book was another book that I read a few years ago called The Comfort Crisis. The idea behind Lost and Found had been brewing for quite a while. And there are multiple contributing factors, but that I'm just trying to remember the author's name. I think it's Michael Easter. But anyway, it's basically it's a version of the question you just asked. And so my answer is, well, firstly, I would say there's nothing inherently wrong with comfort. I did a project recently, for a company where we talked about hygge, which is a Danish concept of it's almost like a Danish version of happiness, but it's about comfort, particularly through winter months where, that nice feeling where you snuggle up with a blanket with some, soup or a stew. And so that, that's a version of there's all different versions of happiness, but hygge, Hygge, is one version. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's a wonderful thing to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to feel secure. I wouldn't suggest that people should ever, completely shy away or eliminate that from their lives. However, if that's all you do, if all you do is stay safe and comfortable, then it's not hard to imagine that will lead to a fairly limited life. It might not necessarily be a terrible one, but that, going back to another point you made, if we wrap ourselves in cotton wool just to feel safe and secure and comfortable, we might not come to any harm, but will we have excitement? Will we have joy? Will we experience love? To experience love, for example, you've got to approach that boy, girl, man, woman. That's scary. You might get rejected. But, with all of those things, again, with the lostness comes the found, with the fear comes the excitement. One of the examples I talk about in the books, when I went skydiving, anyone that's done some version of that, for me, it was the most terrifying and most exhilarating experience in my life at the same time. So to come back to your question again, there's nothing wrong with comfort. But there's also nothing wrong with discomfort if we approach it the right way. And in fact, if we approach discomfort, in a sensible, risk managed type way, not taking ridiculous risks, but if we stretch ourselves a little bit more and more, that's how we grow, that's how we develop, that's how we become better, that's how we have new experiences. And with new experiences can come a whole different form of happiness and joy and contentment that's just as, if not more important.
Tim, I absolutely adore you. Thank you for giving me so much of your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me. And it's a pity that we're on other sides of the continent these days. But hopefully we'll catch up in the real world again sometime soon. Thanks so much again, Casey.
Pleasure.